When I started baking with whole grain, one of the things that I did was buy a mill. I like the fact that I can store whole grains in an airtight container and they'll keep indefinitely. Once you mill whole grain flour, because it contains the germ and the bran, it can go bad fairly quick, so it needs to be refrigerated or frozen. And I didn't want to sacrifice my freezer space for that. So, but if you're not going to bake often with whole grain, I don't know that you would get the return on your investment. So you may just want to buy some wholemeal flours and put it in the freezer or the refrigerator. There's no harm in that. It's just one of those things that I just don't have room for it, and I don't want to buy another refrigerator because I don't have space. So I use my mill to grind the wheat, the rye, and the rice that I line my bannetons with. So we'll start with 100 grams of rye. I have 100 grams of wheat berries in the bottom of the bowl, and I'll put both the wheat and the rye in my mill at the same time. The mill is set on the finest setting. Once I have my wheat and rye flour in the bowl, I add 300 grams of warm water, 125 grams of sourdough starter, and 15 grams of honey. This honey is from our apiary on the farm, and last year we had lots of buckwheat and wildflowers, and the flavor of the honey is just lovely. If you don't have honey in your pantry, then by all means you can certainly use molasses, but I think the whole grains benefit from a little bit of a sweetener. I mix this well, and I let it sit for 15-20 minutes, and I just let the whole grains have a chance to grab a hold of some of the moisture before I add the bread flour. I feel like the bread flour outcompetes the whole grain a little bit. So I use 200 grams of King Arthur bread flour and 12 grams of kosher salt. I mix that in. And then I will add that to my whole grain mixture. I add it in 2 batches just because then that way it's a little more manageable. The Danish dough whisk does a lovely job of pulling the moisture through the dough, so I don't have to use my hands and get in there yet. Once you add the second batch of flour, it does take a little bit of work, and when you're done it will resemble a really stiff cookie dough. When I get that all incorporated, I'll let that sit for 30 minutes before I do my first series of stretch and folds. So here's the dough after it's sat for 30 minutes. It's pretty brittle at this point. If you were to pull it too far, it would actually just pull right off the end. So I don't stretch it tremendously. Stretching it helps do a couple things. One, it incorporates the flour, and 2, it helps develop gluten strength. You may notice I don't use bench flour. I actually dip my hands in just a little bit of water. Keeps the dough from sticking to my fingers quite so bad. I cover it with a tea towel and I let it sit for 30 minutes, and I come back and you can see the appearance of the dough has changed. It has a little more gloss to it. Once again, I put my hands in the ramekin with a little bit of water, and I lift the dough up off the bottom of the bowl so that I can stretch and fold it. Out of habit, I usually make this into a little bit of an oval, and then I pull the furthest end away from me, almost like stretching taffy. You'll notice I put a little water on the top every single time. I don't know that that's necessary. It's just a habit. I do it with all of my doughs. I cover it with a tea towel and let it sit for 30 minutes. And now we're back to the third stretch and fold, and the dough has really changed quite a bit. It's much more elastic. So I take that first stretch and come back halfway. The other one I come back all the way. All four sides into the center, and then I invert it bottom side up. At this point, I let the dough rest on the counter anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, depending on the temperature in the house. Today I had the wood stove going, so it only took about 4 hours for it to look like I wanted it to. Not quite double in size, but close. I use my dough scraper to loosen the dough from the bowl. It's pretty tacky. The rye flour and the extra water make the dough a little bit difficult to manage. So I add a little water to my butcher block top here just so the dough doesn't stick. You want to be careful not to put too much water because it can really turn into a sloppy mess if you do. I stretch my dough to the shape of a square, and I prepare my basket banneton. Dampen my banneton, and I add a generous amount of rice flour, and this will allow the dough to release easily in the morning when I go to bake it. At this point, I take my dough, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in a corner, and I'm going to pull it over center. Then I go to the next corner, pull it over center, and I repeat on all 4 corners. The bottom of the dough now is pretty rough looking. If I was to put that in my banneton at this point, it would just kind of open up almost like a tulip or a flower, and it wouldn't stay together. So I continue to shape using my thumb, pressing down in the center. Once I get to the point where I feel like the top of the dough is right on the edge of wanting to be overextended, I flip it over, and now I'm going to create a little tension on the top, and I'm going to knit the bottom together with a rocking motion, pushing forward a quarter and pulling back a quarter of a turn. And I'm cupping my fingers slightly under. This takes a little bit of a practice, but when done correctly, the bottom will knit together and you won't need to pinch it. I wet my dough scraper and I invert it into my banneton, and I cover it up and put it in the refrigerator anywhere from 14 to 36 hours. For me, it's right around the 18-hour mark usually. The dough's been in the refrigerator a little longer than normal today. Had some things happening on the farm, so I invert it. Put the rice flour on it. Any delicate scoring I do first. I use a gadget called a super peel. It's wonderful for transferring dough, whether it's pizza dough or bread dough. I cover up with a very inexpensive roasting pan. My oven's at 500 degrees, and it's been preheating for just about an hour. I set my timer. I usually wait for the bread to cool completely, but today, for the sake of showing you, it's beautiful. Yum. It's like a beautiful dessert. I'll be very honest with you. It's Probably one of the best pieces of bread I've ever had.